Thank you so much for joining us at First Baptist Church for this Wednesday night service. I'm going to give you the title of the message today to begin with because it will help connect the message with the verse I'm going to share with you in just a minute. There's some things about my own personal story that I want to tell you, and we're going to talk about 3 valleys of discouragement. That's the title of tonight's message. In 1997, the Lord was speaking to me about some adjustments that I needed to make in my own life. I was trying to be open to God and open to His leadership. And as you would know, if you're trying to follow God and God's speaking, something's going to happen that's really going to cause you to consider what He wants of your life. So in the summer of that year, we got contacted from a pastor search committee. It was from the First Baptist Church of Maplewood in Sulphur, Louisiana. We were really impressed by that committee. They came to our home, they listened to me preach, and they asked us if we would come down to Sulphur to look their church over and to look over their community. And so we did. We agreed. We made the 7-hour drive down to Sulphur, Louisiana, and we looked at that community trying to sense what God wanted us to do. But the one overwhelming impression we had of that community was all about geography. It was about how incredibly flat it was. There was no perspective in the terrain, in the up and down. It was just all flat, and that just stuck out at us as we went. And so as we went back home and made this 7-hour drive back home, we talked about our sense of God's leadership. We just really didn't know what God was leading us to do at that time. But as we made the 7-hour journey home and drove up under the carport at our home in Camden, Alabama, I walked in the door and the phone was ringing. And I picked up the phone, and on the phone was another pastor search committee. What are the chances of that? Me making a 7-hour drive and walking in and the phone be ringing. But there they were, another pastor search committee. They wanted to come and hear me preach the next Sunday. I was a little reluctant, a little off balance about what was going on at that point, but we did. We finally agreed for them to come, and they came. And after they came and talked with us, we were a little bit confused still about what God was doing. Here was one pastor search committee, 4 hours from our home. One pastor search committee, 7 hours from our home. Both of them were wanting us to come to their church. So we decided, since we had made a drive to Sulphur, we would make a drive to Hamilton, Alabama. And we made that 4-hour drive without that church knowing. We just wanted to look around the community. And we did. And also, you'd be surprised, but the thing that struck us about that community was the contrast in the geography. The geography where we lived was gently rolling hills. The geography of Sulphur had been incredibly flat. And the geography of Camden, we saw really not many houses in the community in the area we were driving around, because we didn't know where the houses were. But all we saw were hills and valleys. And when the search committee did talk to me again, and I told them about my impression of their community, I said, I didn't see many people there. All I saw were hills and valleys. Well, across the course of the next couple of weeks, both churches kept calling me to know what I was going to do, and I was confused. How was I to know? The size of each church was essentially the same, and so all I knew to do was to ask the Lord and to just continue in the course of my daily Bible reading, and that's what I did, asking God for some direction, some indication of His plan for my life. And as would have it, my Bible reading, I was in the book of Deuteronomy at that time, and I came across Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 11 and 12. And here's the verses I read on a particular day. But the land which you are about to cross to possess is a land of hills and valleys. It drinks water from the rain of heaven, a land for which the Lord your God cares. The eyes of the Lord your God are always on it, from the beginning of the year even to the end of the year. Did you know that that verse appears only once in the entire Bible? Only once in the entire Bible is the promised land referred to as a land of hills and valleys. And it also happened that during the course of that same week, when I read that verse, that the Moody Bible Institute verse of the week, we were avid listeners to Moody Radio, the Moody Bible Institute verse of the week were these same two verses from Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 11 and 12. What are the chances of that? Well, the chances are good, because these are things that only God can do. Only God can speak specifically to you with a word that relates to you and relates to your own experiences. God is very practical in that way. So on the basis of what seemed to be the clear leadership from the Lord, we chose the church in the hills and valleys, and we moved to Hamilton, Alabama. And we were there for just short of 20 years before coming here. What I would come to understand, however, through that 20-year journey is that the land of hills and valleys to which God was leading me was really less about geography and more about what was going to happen in my own spiritual journey. And so in my spiritual journey, I had some mountaintop experiences, some high hill experiences in Hamilton, and I also had some deep valley experiences in Hamilton. And so today I want to talk to you about those three valleys of discouragement that we find in Scripture. There are three of them in the Old Testament. All these valleys have names, and they're all Hebrew names. You read some of them in the Hebrew, and you just sort of read over them. The other one is translated, but you don't see the Hebrew words. So now I'm going to give you the three Hebrew words, the three titles of these valleys. The first one, the first valley of discouragement, is the valley of Achor. The second valley of discouragement is the valley of Baca, and the third valley of discouragement is the valley of Zalmaved. And I'll explain those to you as we go. The first valley appears in the book of Joshua. The children of Israel, as you know, had a major defeat in the Promised Land. It came right after they had the great victory of the Battle of Jericho. But because one of the men in the camp, the man named Achan, took something, some loot from Jericho and buried it in his tent and hid it, the next battle the children of Israel went through, they were soundly defeated. It had nothing to do with the size or strength of their army, but it had everything to do with the problem of sin in the camp. And so as a result of that, because of the defeat, the people of Israel were very discouraged. God's discipline came into the life of Achan and his family were destroyed as a result of God's judgment. And so the place where that happened was named the Valley of Achor. And let me read you that passage from Joshua chapter 7, verse 26. They raised over him a great heap of stones that stands to this day, and the Lord turned from the fierceness of his anger. Therefore the name of that place has been called the Valley of Achor to this day. The Valley of Achor means the valley of trouble, or the valley of troubling. This was trouble of their own making. Have you ever brought trouble into your life because of sin or because of some decision that you've made without following God's guidance? And when you do, it causes calamity to just come rolling into your life. It causes trouble. And so you might find yourself walking through the valley of trouble, and it's trouble that you caused, you created, because you didn't follow God. Later in the history of God's people, they would also come into that valley again due to their own sin. And God would bring them there. This is what it says in the book of Hosea, chapter 2, verse 15. Again, I want you to notice God speaks of the valley of Achor, but listen what he says about it at this particular time. He says, "Therefore, I will allure her and bring her into the wilderness." That is, bring his people. He would bring them into a time of difficulty. And he said, "And I will speak kindly to her. Then I will give her vineyards from there, and the valley of Achor, the valley of trouble, as a door of hope. And she will sing there as in the days of her youth, as in the day when she came up from the land of Egypt." What do those verses mean? Well, they mean simply this, that sometimes that's exactly what God does in our lives. He brings us into a time of trouble or difficulty. He brings us into the wilderness. And in that wilderness experience that we have, in that time of trouble, we begin to cry out to God. We begin to return to Him. And so the valley of trouble actually becomes for us a door of hope. So I want to remind you today that if you are in some valley of trouble, if you find yourself in the valley of Achor, God can make it into a door of hope. That's something only God can do. Don't try to do that. Don't try to manipulate your own circumstances, but rather follow God, do what God wants you to do, listen only to Him, and God can turn that thing around. In the book of Jeremiah, God reveals His purpose in bringing His people into difficulty. We looked at these two verses some weeks ago, but they're worth looking at again. Jeremiah chapter 29, verses 12 through 14. And God said, then, and then is in that season of calamity, in that wilderness experience that He was going to bring them into. He said, then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. And you will seek me and you will find me when you search for me with all your heart. And I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and I will restore your fortunes, and I will gather you from all the nations and from all the places where I have driven you, declares the Lord, and I will bring you back from the place where I sent you into exile. But first, God had to send them into exile. He had to send them into a wilderness experience. He had to send them through the valley of trouble. The valley of trouble would become that door of hope. Again, that's something only God can do as we depend on Him. So that's exactly where some of you are as you listen to this message. And God has you there specifically so that you will turn back to Him. I want to remind you that regardless how sinful you've been or how far you've strayed from Him or how severe the discipline has been that God has sent into your life, He still loves you. The valley of trouble is one of those valleys of discouragement. But the valley of trouble can become a door of hope when that trouble is released to the Lord. The second valley of discouragement in the Old Testament is the valley of Baca. We'll talk about what Baca means in just a minute. We find that valley mentioned in Psalm 84, verses 5 through 7, where David wrote, and he said, how blessed is the man whose strength is in you, in whose heart are the highways to Zion. Passing through the valley of Baca, they make it a spring. The early rain also covers it with blessings. They go from strength to strength. Every one of them appears before God in Zion. In other words, nobody who passes through the valley of Baca is abandoned. What does Baca mean? Baca means weeping. It means weeping. Passing through the valley of weeping, the valley of sorrow of some sort, the valley of grief. That may be where you are right now. You're passing through some trial that has brought grief and sorrow and difficulty to your heart. All God's people pass through the valley of sorrow at some time in their life. And a variety of things can bring trouble and sorrow into your life. And I don't know what it is for you, but I know what it's been for me. I know what some of those things have been for me. And during that time that I was in Hamilton, I passed through some seasons of sorrow, some seasons of difficulty. And so there are times when we're in trouble and trial that we judge God by the fact of our trial. We say, well, I have this trial, so I must not have God. I have this burden, so I must not have His blessing. I have this sickness, so I must not have His Spirit. I have this problem in my life, so I must not have His presence. Others, on the other hand, judge the trial by the fact that even though they have that difficulty, they also have God. And so they pass through that difficulty, even though their soul is pressed by problems and their eyes are filled by tears. They look for God's presence. They look for God's providence. They look for God's peace, and they find it. Well, I should say what they find is Him. So when the saint of God is passing through the valley of Baca, the valley of weeping, the valley of tears, they make it a spring. What in the world does that mean? Well, you see, the story in the Old Testament is that these people passing through the valley of Baca were on their way to Jerusalem to worship. They were on a pilgrimage. They were on a pilgrimage. And so as they passed through that valley, it must have been a barren valley, a very difficult valley for people to pass through, a waterless valley. And so sometimes when they had to stop in that valley, they didn't have any water, they didn't have any refreshment. All they had was trouble and trial. They had to dig a well. And so one pilgrim passed through and dug a well, and then sometime later another pilgrim would pass through and have trouble, and they would dig a well in their difficulty, and another and another and another, until finally the valley of Baca became a place of springs, a place of refreshment. Well, as you know, sometimes some trial, some difficulty can become the place of God's presence. You can find refreshing from God in those difficult times. And as you know as well, when someone else is passing through difficulty, a difficulty like the one you've walked through, you can come alongside them and you can encourage them in their difficulty. When I was in Hamilton, my congregation watched me walk through some seasons of brokenness, because when you're in a community for 20 years, people see the good, the bad, and the ugly. They see the things that happen in your family. And there were many times that one of those deacons or one of those people in the church would come alongside me, and they would put their arm around me and they would say, "Brother Eddie, we've walked through that same trial that you're walking through, and we want to help you, and we want you to remember that God will be with you." I want to let you know that some of those valleys that I walked through, the 20 years that I was there, God told me I would have hills and I would have valleys. Some of those valleys that I walked through, that I came through, have helped me to be an encouragement to you today. So I'm just telling you from my own experience, God can make the valley of weeping, the valley of tears, a place of refreshment. But again, that's something only God can do. So I'm talking with you about these valleys of discouragement because I have traveled through them. The first one was the valley of Achor. Achor means trouble. God, only God, can turn the valley of trouble into a door of hope. The second one is the valley of Baca, the valley of weeping. Only God can take the valley of weeping, the valley of sorrow, and make it a place of overflowing refreshment, which comes from His presence and the comfort that only He can give. This third valley, likely you've never heard the word, but you've heard about it, and you probably have walked through it. It is the valley of Zalmavet. That's the Hebrew word. These others are given by their Hebrew name in the scripture. It never says the valley of trouble. It says the valley of Achor. It never says the valley of weeping. It says the valley of Baca. And in this verse that we're going to look at, it never says the valley the Hebrew name. It gives the expression, what it means, the valley of Zalmavet. And the word Zalmavet means the deepest darkness and uncertainty. It's a place full of fear. Where do you find that valley in the Bible? Why, you find it in the 23rd Psalm, where this one word is translated by the meaning. It is the valley of the shadow of death. Do you know that shadow? Has it been cast across your family recently? Are you walking through that valley now, or have you in recent months? The shadows in that valley are long and cold. That valley brings sadness and loneliness and doubt. God told me before I went to Hamilton, He said, the land I'm sending you is a land of hills and it's a land of valleys. There were spiritual lessons that I had to learn in that place. And while I was there, I passed through the valley of Zalmavet. I passed through the valley of the shadow of death. My dad died while I was in Hamilton. Even now, as I ponder that valley and the sorrow that it brought to our lives, it's hard for me to think about. My dad used to sing a song to me when I was real little. He would sing, "You got to walk that lonesome valley. You got to walk it by yourself. Nobody else can walk it for you. You got to walk it by yourself." Maybe you know that song. And my daddy sang it to me when I was small. And so when my dad was sick, he died of Parkinson's disease. And I tried to walk with him as he was traveling through that valley. I tried to be there for him, and I asked God to just help me be where I needed to be. And God was faithful to do that. But as I look back at some pictures as I prepared this message, I realized anew the meaning of that song that he sang me. Because there's some roads that only the Lord can walk with you. There's some roads that no matter how much your family wants to walk them with you, You got to walk them alone. And so as I looked back at the pictures of my dad in that time when he was on the feeding tube, I looked at the loneliness on his face, even as he sat in the room with us, that distant look. You've seen it. Death's shadow is cold, it's fearsome. We would all run from it if we could. In Hebrew, it's the valley of Zalmavet. I went through that valley when my dad died, and even as I prepared this message and as I'm talking to you about it, I went through it in other ways that I can't talk about right now. And because of it, that shadow is still cast over my life to some extent. So 3 valleys of discouragement. You might be in one of those valleys right now. The valley of Achor, the valley of trouble. Only God can turn the valley of trouble into a door of hope. And then the valley of Baca, the valley of tears, or the valley of weeping. Only God can make the valley of weeping the valley of refreshment. And then the valley of Zalmavet, the valley of the shadow of death. Each one of these valleys comes with its own promise, by the way, the promise of God's comfort. And in the 23rd Psalm, the valley of Zalmavet, the valley of the shadow of death, also comes with a promise. David said, in the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For the valley of the shadow of death becomes the place of thou art with me. That's what I discovered in the valley of the shadow of death when I walked through it. When my dad died, it became for me the place of the Lord's presence. I knew the comfort of his presence and the comfort of his love. In the Old Testament, there are 3 valleys of discouragement, and there are 2 shadows. One is the shadow of death, found in Psalm 23. In Psalm 91, there's another shadow, the shadow of the Almighty. Charles Haddon Spurgeon once said about the valley of the shadow of death, he said he had no need to fear the shadow of death. He said, what do I have to fear from a shadow? The shadow of a dog can't bite, the shadow of a thief can't steal, and the shadow of death can't harm me. Sometimes I still feel the shade of that awful shadow of the valley of Zalmavet. When I do, I look for that other shadow. So tonight we've considered these 3 valleys of discouragement. The Lord will say to you, as he said to me, the land which you're crossing to possess is a land of hills and valleys, but it drinks water from the dew of heaven. It's a land, the land you're traveling through is a land for which the Lord your God cares. He cares about you and the roads you travel. The eyes of the Lord your God are always on it from the beginning of the year, even to the end of the year. God's eyes are on the hills, but God's eyes are also on the valleys. I know that by experience. And tonight, you may be walking through some lonesome valley. I just want to remind you that the Lord is with you, and God can bring good out of whatever circumstances are happening in your life. I want to thank you so much for listening. I pray that this devotion has been a blessing to you tonight. It's certainly been a blessing for me as I share it. I hope you signed up for church on Sunday. I look forward to seeing you there. God bless you.